Good evening and welcome to Seven Stories Up. We are delighted to have you joining us at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Cynthia Chaldekas and I'm a librarian here at SNFL. And before I introduce tonight's guests, I'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I would also like to remind you that if you don't have a library card, you can get one easily. After the event, you can speak to one of my colleagues outside the door, or you can go to one of the information desks on the floor below and on the first floor, and you can get one very easily. Finally, I'd like to encourage you to visit the NYPL website and take a look at our upcoming Seven Stories Up programs. Tonight, I'm excited about our program with author Larry Tye, who will discuss his book, The Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. Larry will be discussing his book with acclaimed vocalist and native New Yorker, Catherine Russell. My mom loved music, and she played her records on a big stereo console. Her many albums were lined up in a row inside the console cabinet. I remember distinctly the sounds of Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong filling the room with their songs. They were favorites. This was the 1960s, and I was too young to understand who these artists were and just how special they were, especially because they were black. As I got a little older, I would hear chatter about how Louis Armstrong sold out or was pandering to white audiences. I didn't exactly know what that meant then, but I knew it wasn't a compliment. It took me well into adulthood to understand that African American artists of that time did not get a fair shake in the music industry and society at large. They persevered because they had something to say through their song and their sound. Artists like Armstrong, Ellington, and Basie were powerful pioneers, paving the way for so much that has followed. Author Larry Tye has written many books and was an award-winning reporter for the Boston Globe from 1986 to 2001, as well as a reporter for other important newspapers and publications. Joining Larry tonight is vocalist Catherine Russell, who has performed around the world at major jazz festivals and concert halls nationally and internationally. And without further ado, please welcome Larry Tye and Catherine Russell.
Good evening. How's everybody doing? It's an honor for me to talk to this great author and reporter, which it seems like you did your investigative reporting career really informed the way you went about learning about the lives of these great men. And so since your history has already been introduced, but you've written books about Bobby Kennedy and Senator Joe McCarthy, and also about the Pullman Porters, which we are going to get into a little bit later. And so please give a warm welcome to Larry Tye. So the first, I just want to know, how did you end up choosing this topic of these artists, and were you a fan of the music, and what inspired you to actually write about them?
Great. But before I talk about that, I would love to just say, if you didn't know, Catherine Russell is, as has just been said, an extraordinary musician, and she's also part of music royalty. Her father, Louis Russell, was as good as they got, and someday soon we're going to have a book, hopefully, by Catherine's husband on Louis Russell, so we'll be back here in exactly 1 year. And so you asked the question very diplomatically. The other way to ask that same question was, what does a guy who knows as little about music as you do doing writing a book like this. And in the course of researching this book, I would have to ask my wife perpetual questions like, what's the difference again between melody and harmony? And the other way to ask the question is, what did the world need the 201st book on these three guys? And the answer is that I was interested, while I love their life as musicians, I was not about to be able to tell people something new about their music. But I think there's another half to their legacy, and that's the half that I was interested in. What these guys did, what their music did in changing America, and what they did off their bandstands in things that generally didn't get the kind of attention then that it ought to. And I approached this project with my ignorance in hand, the way I did every day that I was a daily journalist. Journalists, as you know, start out the day generally knowing nothing about what they're going to have to educate hundreds of thousands of readers or listeners about later in the day. And so what they do between the beginning of the day and the end of the day is they talk to people who are a whole lot smarter than they are. And in the course of writing this book, I talked to 250 people like that, ranging from Wynton Marsalis to John Batiste to, in a way, one of my favorites was a guy named Bill Clinton, who helped educate me about the politics of jazz. And if I had gone into these people, I tried to use my ignorance as a strength. If I had gone into somebody like Wynton Marsalis and said, I'm a know-it-all author and journalist, and all I want is a quote from you so I can say I talked to the great Wynton Marsalis, he would have rightfully hung up the phone on me. Instead, going in and saying, I want to write about three people who you adore, and I want to do them justice, educate me. And it was endlessly difficult to get him on the phone. It was almost as difficult to get him off the phone because he wanted to express the joy that he felt about these three characters. And all of these guys did that. And when Bill Clinton, so I got a strange call one day from a guy saying that he was Bill Clinton's press secretary, saying the president wants to talk to you. And I was trying to figure out what old Boston Globe colleague was pretending to be Bill Clinton's press secretary. But when 15 minutes later, the phone rang again, and it was Bill Clinton on it, you cannot mimic Bill Clinton's voice. And he wanted to call and talk about Joe McCarthy, who was the subject of my last book. But when he heard what I was writing about, he wanted to tell me all the reasons that he adored Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie to the point where he had their posters up on the walls of his home and his office. And he gave me a great interview, and he made at the end of that interview a promise. And we all know about politicians and their promises. The promise was the next time I came back to New York, we were talking during the pandemic. He said he would take me to his house and his office and show me those posters. Now, I've been back to New York at least 5 times since then, and every time I come here, I call his press secretary and say, is he going to do it now? And every time there's a wonderfully different excuse on why he can't then, but call next time.
So what I love about this book is that each chapter seems to be a reflection of the bigger picture of the times that all of these men were living in. So you get a complete picture of how they lived, of what was going on in the cities, where they grew up, and what was going on in the cities where they each got their big break. So can you talk a little bit about that, about what was going on, maybe, Duke Ellington in Washington, D.C. before he got his break at the Cotton Club, and Count Basie in New Jersey and Red Bank before he got his break in Kansas City. And I know it's a lot, Armstrong in New Orleans, just a little encapsulation of that.
So very brief stories on who these guys were when they started out and as they progressed over time. Louis Armstrong started out, as you all know, in New Orleans. And he started out in a neighborhood in New Orleans that was so tough that it was known as the battlefield. And at age 13, can I borrow, you have a good collar there, can I borrow your collar for a second? So at age 13, on New Year's Eve, a detective came behind Louis Armstrong and grabbed him by the scruff of his neck and threw him into reform school for 18 months. And that was for firing his stepfather's pistol in the air as part of the New Year's celebration in New Orleans. And Louis Armstrong would later say that that saved his life, that the kids he was hanging out with until he was 13 on the streets of New Orleans, most of them didn't make it beyond their teenage years. And what he did then was, according to the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, who was one of two major leaders of the black world back then, Booker T. Washington said that people of Louis Armstrong's generation were not going to throw off the shackles of Jim Crow segregation in time that they could be assured that it would affect their lives. So what you should do if you were a young black growing up then is you should learn how to do one thing better than anybody else could do it, so nobody could ever take it away from you. And Louis Armstrong learned in reform school, a reform school called the Colored Waifs Home, which gives a suggestion of what this segregated, miserable place was like. He learned first how to play the bugle, then how to play the cornet, and then how to blow a trumpet the way nobody had ever blown a trumpet before. And that was something nobody could ever take away from him. And so quickly, when he got out of reform school, he stayed in New Orleans as long as he had to, took off to Chicago, and in Chicago took off in a way that was extraordinary. If you do nothing else, and you remember nothing else that we say tonight, go back and listen sometime to the recordings that Louis Armstrong cut in a tiny studio in the middle of Chicago. The studio was about as big as this stage. And he and 4 other musicians cut a set of jazz records that I think, despite the miserable sound quality, were the best jazz records ever cut. They were known as the Hot Fives, and they are still the standard. You know, much more, they still are the standard. So I have to turn anything musical I'm going to get Catherine's okay on. So Louis Armstrong grows up there in the middle of segregated America. About 500 miles away in Washington, D.C., in the middle of the largest middle-class black community in America, Duke Ellington is growing up. And in a very different kind of household, very middle class. And to give you a sense of what life was like when Duke was a kid, every day he would walk down the steep set of stairs in the house, his favorite house of the 16 that he lived in when he was a kid. He would walk down the stairs and he would tell his young nephews at the bottom of the stairs to bow to him. He would tell his young nieces to curtsy, and he would tell the adults, his parents and his uncles and aunts, that you should basically acknowledge that someday the world was going to know him as what he called the great and the grand Duke Ellington. And over the course of his life, Duke would tell lots of stories on where the nickname Duke came from. You should believe none of them. He dubbed himself Duke, and he lived up to that sense of royalty. And Duke Ellington, again, left his native Washington as quickly as he could and ended up here in Manhattan at a place called the Cotton Club in Harlem, which was, on the one hand, the most elegant jazz club in the world, and on the other hand, was designed to look like a plantation and was a sense, it may not have been in the middle of Jim Crow Southern America, but it was every bit as reflective of the racism of its day. So we're going to now go to the third one, and we're going to move about 50 miles to whatever direction New Jersey is, and to a place called Red Bank, New Jersey. Anybody here been to Red Bank? Great. If you haven't been to Red Bank, don't go to Red Bank, because the one thing really worth knowing about Red Bank is that Count Basie was from there. And as soon as he could, Count Basie wanted to put Red Bank in his rear view mirror. And he initially dreamed about joining the circus as a way of getting the heck out of Red Bank. And he ended up realizing that he could play a piano better than just about anybody. And so he ended up coming to New York and learning literally at the feet of Fats Waller. And I say at the feet because Fats Waller would play an organ as well as a piano, and Count would be looking at Fats Waller's feet to watch what he was doing there. And he very quickly left New York and went to Kansas City, where he developed a unique style known as Kansas City swing. He played in a dive bar called the Reno Club. He was a little bit of a down-and-out guy, Count Basie was in these days. But he luckily had a set of microphones at the Reno Club that were broadcasting his music around America. And a guy named John Hammond, who was in Manhattan, heard that music, and as Hammond would embellish the story, he said the next 5 minutes he jumped on a plane to Kansas City to sign up Count Basie. Well, it took a little longer than 5 minutes, but he did in fact go to Kansas City. He signed him to a contract, and Count Basie never looked back. 3 very different guys, 3 different parts of America, and what they shared, other than the fact that they were born within 5 years of one another, is they would become jazz royalty like Catherine's dad, and their careers would last an unheard of 50 years.
So do you think that the timing, like the times that these men grew up in, also were conducive to them gaining success? You know, Kansas City was a thriving, a lot going on there. Harlem during the Renaissance. And then, of course, the migration from New Orleans to Chicago, which was thriving because of the Great Migration to New York, you know, at that time.
So the answer is yes and no. And the yes part of it is that everywhere you said and everywhere they went was thriving. And it was thriving in a couple ways. One, it was thriving economically, but the other is it was thriving in a way that was very special for people who were jazz musicians. It was thriving because of Prohibition. And you remember Prohibition was this crazy attempt to say, we're going to ban alcohol and we're going to make it illegal. Well, it never really banned it. It did make it illegal, which meant that mobsters, from Dutch Schultz in New York to the Pendergast machine in Kansas City to everybody from Al Capone on down to Chicago, they had their speakeasies where they sold their alcohol under the table, and they were looking for ways to draw people into these illegal distilleries. And the way they did it was looking at the cheapest but the most rollicking kind of music they could bring in, which was jazz. And every one of the jazz musicians that we're talking about tonight, along with all the other big jazz musicians of that era, had a benefactor who was a mobster. And that was the way they were protected from other mobsters, but it was also the way they paid the bills. And so that is the yes. The yes is they took off. The no is that they were in an incredibly racist time in America. I mean, I'm not sure that there's ever been a non-racist time, but this was an especially virulent time after Reconstruction had fallen apart, and when racism was bad enough that when Duke Ellington, at a point where he was one of the most recognizable musicians in the world, when he went to Lynchburg, Virginia to perform, there was nowhere that he could stay that night. Nowhere would accept blacks. There was no black boarding house or hotel in town. And when Duke Ellington's manager went to a white-owned hotel and said, Duke Ellington is filling up an auditorium, you got to have a room somewhere that you can put him in tonight. The owner of the hotel said, yes, we will give him a room, but it will be twice the charge. And the manager said, what do you mean twice the charge? And the owner of the hotel explained, twice the charge because after Duke Ellington sleeps in this bed, we will of course have to burn his pillowcases and his sheets. And this is the no part of it. The no is what they had to overcome was extraordinary. So the idea that they were successful with their great musicianship is a no-brainer. The idea that they could make it with that racist environment that they were facing everywhere they went was a kind of courage that was amazing.
Yes, and I've heard stories about, sure, we'll feed you, but then we'll have to shatter the plates that you've eaten on because we can't serve white people on these plates after you eat on them. So, this was common practice. I've heard you talk about how you see the music of these men changing the minds of people by listening to the music in their homes eventually, and how people accepted these men's artistry in their homes where they would never, live next to them. They would never want to eat next to them. They wouldn't want, just the kind of thing you were just talking about.
So what I think was going on was that in this era, and we're talking this era runs again from the 1920s to the 1960s and beyond, what I think was going on was that white racist men who would, as you say, never have let a black cross their threshold were at that same time wooing their sweethearts with the music of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. That white racist women who, if a black man were coming towards them on the sidewalk, would walk to the other side of the street. When they got into the privacy of their own living rooms, they kicked off their high heels and they danced to the toe-tapping music of the Count Basie Orchestra. And I ought to mention that in that era, they used to say that if your toes didn't tap when you heard Count Basie, you ought to go to the doctor the next day because something was anatomically wrong with you. But for once in those households, race fell away as an issue because you couldn't see the race of the person who was coming to you via the radio or the record player. And I think that those people who were listening to that music, and we're talking about millions of Americans, that at some point it dawned on them that if these men could produce the kind of genius music that they were producing, that maybe they deserved equal rights. But don't trust me to tell you that they had that kind of influence. Trust a speech that Martin Luther King delivered in Berlin in 1961 that nobody paid much attention to at the time, where he said, if not for these jazz musicians, there would have been a civil rights movement, but it would have taken years longer, because they set the table in the same way people that I wrote about who were playing Negro League baseball, like Satchel Paige, or who were Pullman porters, they were setting the table, but with many fewer people. Jazz records were selling by the millions, and they were reaching into millions of white households.
I'm so glad you brought up the Pullman porters, because you also wrote an incredible book about Pullman porters. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, my parents have talked to me a lot about how they traveled, especially in the South. So can you talk a little bit about the Pullman Company and the Pullman porters, just especially Duke Ellington loved his Pullman car and what that was all about?
So 20 years ago, I wrote a book on these amazing black men called Pullman porters. And if you don't know who they were, the Pullman sleeping cars that they worked on were the most elegant way you could travel across America in the days before airplane travel. And the Pullman porters, the best job that a black man could have in America from the end of the Civil War until the 1960s, in terms of everything from pride in the black community to money to just about everything, getting to see America, was as a Pullman porter. And when I wrote about the Pullman porters, there were 40 of them still alive. A year later, when the book came out, there were 20 of them still alive, and today, sadly, there are 0 Pullman porters alive. But they made me promise that someday I would write a book on their 3 favorite passengers who were named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And the reason the Pullman porters had this relationship with the Jazzmen, to me says a lot, not just about them, but about America. And the reason is because when these guys, I mentioned the indignity that Duke Ellington had to go through in going to that hotel in Lynchburg. Well, when these 3 men would travel below the Mason-Dixon line, and we're talking in an era when Louis Armstrong, it was said in this era that Louis Armstrong was one of the 2 most recognizable figures of popular culture, of American popular culture worldwide. And the other one was Mickey Mouse. And I think it was in the order of Mickey Mouse was here and Louis Armstrong was somewhere here. But when they would travel south, if they went into the wrong restaurant trying to get a meal, in a restaurant that served only whites, or they tried to book a room in the wrong hotel, they could be berated, they could be beaten, and in the worst case, but in too many cases, they could end up at the end of a lynching noose. And so what they did to ensure their safety, when they could afford it, and they could afford it for much of their career, they would rent, to go south with them, a private Pullman sleeping car. And at night, if they were performing a concert in a place like in a place like Atlanta, they would perform their concert and know that afterwards they would have a great meal waiting for them, cooked by the dining staff on the Pullman sleeping cars. They would have a plush bed made up for them by the Pullman porters, and they would have safe space. And what they did in return for their Pullman porters who were taking care of them, in the middle of the night, in this closed capsule of the railroad car, they would perform a private concert just for the Pullman porters. And Catherine, I don't know about you, but if I could go back to just about any moment in history, having the Duke Ellington Band play just for me in the acoustics of a railroad car would be a pretty special place to be.
Amazing, amazing. Yes, yes. And, you know, it's such an amazing story about Pullman porters because they were basically ex-slaves, right?
They were.
Who George Pullman, you know, he and I just love the story of this, that he chose the darkest black men that he could find so that no one would ever mistake them for passengers, you know. So because mostly Pullman cars were for upper crust white folks, basically. And, you know, and then before the Green Book, you know, which I didn't really realize that the Green Book, not only did it have information about places to stay, but it had other information about, so just talk a second about that.
So everybody knows the story of the Green Book from the book or from the movie or from the, there are exhibitions now going around the country about the Green Book. Long before there was a Green Book telling black travelers where it was safe to go, there were Pullman porters telling black travelers where it was safe to go because they knew, because they traveled the country. They were the conduit for more information about what was going on in one black community to get to another black community. For in the civil rights era, they were the conduit on places and people who were involved in the movement. And they also took the two best black newspapers in America. No offense to New York, but the two best black newspapers in America were the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier. And they took these newspapers with them on the trains, and they threw them off in small towns across the South. And they had to disguise them. If a black person was caught picking up a Chicago Defender, that was not something that would stand them well in their racist small towns. So they would put them in plain paper wrappers so nobody knew what they were tossing off the train. But one of the reasons the Great Migration happened, and Isabel Wilkerson talks about this in her book, was because the Pullman porters spread word across the South that there was a potentially better life in cities like Detroit and New York and Chicago, and that encouraged people to go there, but they had to get that word, and they sure as heck weren't getting that word by reading their local small-town paper in wherever, Alabama, and they were getting it by reading these newspapers from up north. And the Pullman porters were an amazing conduit, and they told not just average travelers, they told, very importantly, Negro League baseball players and jazz musicians where it was safe to go, what person ran a rooming house and would serve them a great meal and had a bed for them in whatever town they were going to.
Amazing. So I'm going to turn to these three men and their relationships to women.
Aha.
And I because, you know, I had to talk a little bit about that. And from reading this book, I really started to understand, I had a little more compassion for their views of the roles of women in their lives because they were leading very rough lives. So it wasn't like they could just settle down with a woman, you know, and women didn't really understand, you know, they had many women, you know, and they just didn't understand why these guys just couldn't settle down and stick to one woman. And I think after they had to unwind somehow,
They
you
did.
know?
So your definition is right on target, and you sound more forgiving than maybe I was in the book in terms of. So these were guys who took their faith seriously, and they all believed in God. They all prayed before every meal. They did all kinds of things, and they also looked at the list of the 10 Commandments, and they observed very carefully at least 5 of them. And the one about honoring your spouse, and I don't remember the exact wording of that commandment, they didn't do a whole lot. And I want to just take you through, because to me it humanized who they were. It wasn't excusing what they did to their wives, but it said these were guys who were flesh and blood, and they had foibles and they had strengths. And to me, at the end of the day, their strengths so outnumbered their weaknesses that it was more understandable. But I want to tell you about some of the weaknesses. So in Louis Armstrong's case, he had 4 wives. And the first 3 wives lasted the moral equivalent of 15 minutes. And the 4th wife, named the Lucille Armstrong, who he was married to for 30-plus years and lived in a wonderful house in Corona section of Queens that you should go visit, because it's called the Louis Armstrong House and Museum, and it is what a museum ought to be, which is the way exactly the replica of, not the replica, the actual where Louis Armstrong lived. So you can see the bathroom where he had mirrors on the walls and on the ceilings and everywhere. You can see his kitchen, which was straight out of the Jetsons, the best of everything. But you can also imagine that this was where Lucille Armstrong, every time Louis committed an infidelity, Lucille got something else added to that kitchen or added to that house as the price of taking him back. And he was, as you say, on the road 300 to 365 days, and he would say he couldn't control himself, and Lucille learned to accept that. She knew that, as Ethel Kennedy did when I was writing about Bobby Kennedy, Ethel Kennedy knew that Bobby Kennedy had committed infidelity repeatedly, but she knew that he came home to her and the kids every night, or just about every night. And the same thing happened with Louis Armstrong. With Count Basie, he was only married twice. The first marriage, very short. The last one, very long-lived. In a set of letters, a new set of letters that were donated to the Institute for Jazz Studies, there are these wonderful letters from Count Basie to his wife and to his disabled daughter that he would send regularly from the road. Half of the letters were when he was asking to be forgiven. And when he thought that his wife, Catherine, might not forgive him, he would direct the letters to their disabled daughter, Diane, knowing that Catherine would read the letters and that it might tug at a heartstring. And in Catherine Basie's case, the price of taking her husband back after she kicked him out a number of times was that all the assets were put into her and Diane's name, and they moved from New York, a wonderful neighborhood, Adderley Park, is that how you say the name, I think? Adderley Park, which was a terrific neighborhood with an incredible crew of jazz musicians. You know, around the corner was Mercer Ellington, Duke's son, and just the jazz royalty was there in Adderley Park. But they ended up moving to Freeport because that was, again, the price. Catherine loved Freeport and figured that taking Count Basie back, she ought to get something in return, and she got a great house in Freeport. And with Duke Ellington, he was married to one woman his entire life. But that marriage was not a real marriage except for the couple of years after they got married. And then they were separated amicably for the rest of his life. And the reason he didn't divorce his wife was because he had so many mistresses that it was the perfect excuse to say, I'm already married, why he didn't have to marry any of his mistresses. And I want to say that when I came to New York researching the book, a wonderful woman who is not here tonight, and so I can say what her age is. A woman named Mercedes Ellington, Duke's granddaughter, took me on a Duke Ellington tour of Harlem. And that tour consisted of visiting everywhere that Duke played. And we went to everywhere that he lived. But the longest part of that tour was when she took me to everywhere where Duke stashed one of his mistresses. And that was a very long tour indeed. And he had several going at any given time.
But they loved their mothers.
They did love their
They
mothers.
got
They
all
sure did.
kinds of inspiration from their mothers and strength.
Were ambivalent about their fathers and loved their
Right,
mothers.
and loved their mothers. So, also, they were, I would say, Ellington and Armstrong more so, criticized for going into different areas of music. You know, Louis Armstrong was criticized for crossing over and singing popular music when they said, oh, you know, why don't you just stick to, you know, New Orleans, traditional New Orleans music, and then Ellington was criticized for writing longer pieces, you know, and also for writing pieces that made commentary on race.
So they did. They all said we speak through our music. That we don't want to comment on issues, controversial issues like race relations in America, and they all thankfully didn't do that. They went beyond that. And in Duke Ellington's case, the classic situation was when he went one time to Baltimore, and there was a protest by students at Johns Hopkins University about a diner called the Blue Jay Diner in Baltimore that wouldn't serve blacks. And the protesters said to Duke, will you join us in this sit-in? It will really get attention. And he said no. And they asked him a second time, and he said no. And they asked him the magical third time, and he said yes. And he joined them in the sit-in, and that was page one news around the world. And it was page one news partly because it was an incredible picture of one of Baltimore's finest police officers leading Duke Ellington out of the Blue Jay Diner. And that was a big deal. In Count Basie's case, he said, I speak through my music, but in just after World War II, Count Basie put in his contracts that he signed with venues around the country a clause that said no integrated audience, no integrated band allowed, no Count Basie. And he, a generation before Duke Ellington did that, Count Basie was saying, I will only play where I can bring my band and bring my friends to listen to me. Louis Armstrong faced the toughest situation. As our eloquent introducer said tonight, Louis Armstrong was accused by young whites and young blacks of being an Uncle Tom, if not an Aunt Jemima. And that was incredibly cutting to this guy who grew up in Jim Crow America and didn't have to have young whippersnappers coming and telling him, you're not militant enough. He knew what it was like to grow up with very harsh segregation. And he finally let it out one night. Do you remember in 1957 what the signature civil rights issue, the place in America and the issue that made the headlines in 57? Little Rock, Arkansas. Remind us, who said that? Right, Orville Faubus. So there was a racist governor of Arkansas named Orville Faubus who, when the courts said to these 9 kids, you will integrate all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Governor Faubus, anticipating what George Wallace would say a couple years later, said essentially, you will integrate this school over my dead body. And our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower, said, this is a state matter, I'm not going to get involved. So a reporter who made his career by asking this question showed up at Louis Armstrong's hotel and said, Mr. Armstrong, what do you think about what's going on in Little Rock? And Armstrong said, sit down and I'll tell you. And what he told him was he called Governor Faubus a word that I won't use in polite company tonight, but it began with M and it ended with R, and I can't count exactly how many letters it had. But it got translated in a family newspaper to an uneducated plowboy. He called our war hero president a gutless so-and-so. It was shocking. all the reporters and the editorial writers who had been calling Louis Armstrong an Uncle Tom were now calling him an unpatriotic American, and it looked like he couldn't win. But there was one person among all these people who paid special attention to what Louis Armstrong had said, and that was the guy in the White House named Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower adored Louis Armstrong, and I can't prove the cause and effect, but I'm convinced the reason Eisenhower sent in troops to protect the group of kids that became known as the Little Rock Nine, that the reason he did it was because Louis Armstrong had called him out and embarrassed him.
Yes. Can you talk about, we're coming to the end, unfortunately, but can you talk about their early hits versus the later hits of the three men?
So I'm also noticing that this is great. I don't know if you can see it here, but we have a clock ticking, so we keep to our schedule, and we'll let people ask questions. So I'm going to keep this answer short. Each of them had a signature song at the beginning that reflected who they were, much more than the songs at the end. In Louis Armstrong's case, it was a controversial song, When It's Sleepy Time Down South. In Count Basie's case, it was a rollicking song called 1 O'Clock Jump. And in Duke Ellington's case, it was a bunch of songs that nobody will remember today. But what everybody remembers, if I were to ask you, name one song by Duke Ellington, what would you say? Take the A Train. So everybody says that everywhere, and Duke Ellington played it every night that he played. But I want to tell you a very quick story about Take the A Train. So Duke Ellington, there was a guy in Pittsburgh, a very smart young kid named Billy Strayhorn. And Billy Strayhorn went to one of Duke Ellington's concerts and said, I want to work for you, Duke. And Duke said, you're too young, but call me when you graduate from high school, and we'll talk about it. And so 5 seconds after he graduated from high school, Billy Strayhorn's calling Duke Ellington, and Duke says, come to New York, and we will discuss whether I will hire you. And he gave him explicit directions. There was no GPS back then. The directions included, at the end, take the A train. So Billy Strayhorn was precocious enough and brilliant enough that he decided, if I write a song based on the directions Duke Ellington sent me, Duke will hire me. Billy wrote the song, Duke hired him, and every time he played that song, which was every night, exactly a third of the time he would acknowledge Billy Strayhorn. This is a Billy Strayhorn composition. The other 2/3, he would conveniently forget to say who had composed the song because it was now Duke's theme song, and the world thought that it was Duke Ellington's, not Billy Strayhorn's. The song at the end of his career that was the most well-known song for Count Basie was a song called Fly Me to the Moon. And it was a song that he recorded with Frank Sinatra that people didn't realize that the Apollo astronauts actually took that song up to space with them on their little recorder and listened to it. And so the song flew the astronauts to the moon, and it flew Count Basie to the top of the charts. Louis Armstrong's signature song, and I'm sort of sad to say this, at the end of his life, his signature song was Hello, Dolly. He took a song that was an entirely mediocre song, and he made it into an extraordinary song because of his voice and because of his trumpet playing and because he was Louis Armstrong. And he knocked, I think he was at 68 years old, he knocked with Hello, Dolly, the Beatles, off of #1 on the Billboard charts, which was not bad for a 68-year-old. One last thing I want to tell you about Louis Armstrong. So he had 2 talents as a musician. One, everybody knows, was his trumpet playing. The other was taking the most unorthodox voice ever and making it into the most irresistible voice ever, to the point where kids in Chicago, when he was coming up in Chicago, in the middle of the winter, would stick their heads out of the window, hoping to catch cold so that they could sound as raspy as Louis Armstrong.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Larry Ty. That's beautiful. And I think now it's time for a Q&A. Are we going to do that? and they
We
will
have,
come around to you with microphones.
Great. So the microphone's coming to you there.
What was the adjective you used about him singing Hello Dolly? Because that was coming back to me as I was listening to this whole thing, and that would be a real sort of maybe an Uncle Tom image in that movie.
So
Yeah.
it was. So I said that it was. He took an incredibly mediocre song
Oh,
and
mediocre.
made it into a meteoric hit. And he was initially not impressed with the song, and then it sort of grew on him. But it was generally, you go to a Broadway hit and you listen to music, and then the song becomes popular afterwards. Louis Armstrong was what made the original Hello Dolly play into a hit. His song was strong enough that it could carry with it a Broadway play and a movie and a whole set of other institutions built around Hello Dolly.
Well, how did the black audience respond to his role in that movie?
So it was really interesting. Black audiences, Louis Armstrong, there was no question that especially as he grew older, he was trying to draw in a white audience on television and to his performances. And I'm convinced that he never really lost his black audiences. Young white and black militants may have critiqued him, but the audience that came out to see him from the black world and from the white world always loved him and recognized something that I never recognized when I was a kid, and my book is partly a mea culpa, that you could be an artist and an entertainer at the same time, and that being an entertainer and smiling and bringing out a bunch of handkerchiefs didn't mean that you weren't a genius, and he was a genius.
On this side over here.
I wonder if you could say a word or two about Lillian Harden, Armstrong's second wife, and the role that she played in grooming him to look and behave exactly like a very, very professional on the stage, and as well, because she was an accomplished musician, she added a great deal of arrangements and other songs to his repertoire.
So after 50 minutes talking to you, no, I can't say just a word or two about anything, but I think that the Lillian Harden was amazing. In that era, if you were a black woman jazz performer, you faced a double stigma, the stigma of being black and the stigma of being a woman. And even men like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington used disparaging words to refer to vocalists as thrushes or canaries or other things that weren't exactly. So the only role open to women in that era in jazz was as a vocalist. But the exception to that rule was a woman named Lillian Harden, who was an extraordinary band leader, piano player, composer, arranger. She was extraordinary because she was very talented, and that's what carried her there. But she was also able to do that, I'm convinced, because while her first two names were Lillian Harden, her third name was Armstrong, and she was Louis's second wife, and she was Hot Lil on those great recordings that I told you about, the Hot Fives. And that is why my book was called Jazzmen rather than Jazz Musicians or whatever, because the three of these guys were emblematic of what was going on in that era of jazz, and it was a man's world sadly.
Hi, thank you very much for the program. I did want to ask you, though, about, there were a lot of things talked about tonight, but not so much about how these three musicians transformed America. A few times you mentioned it,
Sure.
But would you be willing to say more about that?
I would. So I think what they did was the way Martin Luther King recognized that they took their music, and the same way that Satchel Paige, when I wrote about him, took the fact that he was the most entertaining and talented pitcher, I'm convinced, ever to pick up a baseball, and he used his artistry to bring in enough white fans that people like Branch Rickey decided to integrate baseball. These three guys took their music into white households and set the table for everything from Brown versus Board of Education to the civil rights movement generally. And they did it. I'm convinced that social change happens in America never in a straight line. And when I was taking my 5th grade civics class, we learned that Brown versus Board came from Plessy versus Ferguson and all kinds of other decisions that I can't remember the names of. But I think it's a zigzaggy line, and that people watch black artists on a baseball field and say, geez, if they can do that, shouldn't they get equal rights? And they watch people like the Pullman Porters and said, geez, if I went on a trip across country and I entrusted my kids to take care of the Pullman Porters to take care of my kids, don't they deserve equal rights? I think likewise, the form of black artistry that white America heard or saw more about than anything was jazz, and that it occurred to people that maybe blacks deserve civil rights for that reason because they were geniuses there as well. And I can't prove it, but I think it, and Martin Luther King thought it, and without getting into politics and what happened last week, I think that we hope that every step we take backwards, ultimately, the way Martin Luther King said, that the arc of history bends towards justice, and I think it will, whoever's in the White House or anywhere else, and that's what happened with these jazzmen. And that was a long-winded, not especially clear answer, but you get my point, I think.
I was hoping you could expand more on the relationship of these three men with some of the women of jazz, and I'm thinking in particular what you heard about in your reporting, Ella Fitzgerald and Nina Simone.
Yes. So if you do like I did when I was writing this book and ask your Alexa to play the songs of my musicians, if you listen to Louis Armstrong, or if you ask for Ella Fitzgerald, you will hear Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald performing together. These guys were incredibly bonded with every prominent woman performer in jazz. Billie Holiday played her best days for the Count Basie Orchestra. Ella Fitzgerald had the most fun when she was with Armstrong and Ellington. The great Mary Jo Williams had a brilliant time Mary Lou Williams had an amazing time with Duke Ellington, in spite of the fact that he stole a lot of her songs and didn't give him credit. There was an amazing bonding. And where there wasn't a bonding is between the three of them. They were very different guys, came from different worlds. Duke Ellington was the aristocratic, elegant Duke Ellington. Louis Armstrong wore his heart. His heart could come out every time you heard him play the trumpet. You saw his heart come out of the bell of his trumpet. And Count Basie was an incredibly private guy. So they didn't want to be together much. They said nice things about one another, but seldom performed together. And why, if you were Louis Armstrong, should you share the spotlight with one of the few people who would be able to get an equal spotlight, who was Count Basie, and Duke Ellington? So, again, long-winded, but they loved their vocalists, and the vocalists loved them.
Thanks so much for this. If you happen to wind up with an extra ream of paper and you had to add another jazz person, make it 4,
Yes.
who would that be?
So I've had more suggestions on who the fourth one ought to be. And I want to tell you also that I was very naive going into this book. I thought if you wrote a book about 3 different people, you only had to do a third of the work for each of them. And nobody wants to, when they're reading a book about 3 characters, if you're talking about Louis Armstrong, nobody wants to think that you only did a third of the research you should on him. So I ended up with, when you were talking about reams of paper, when my process in writing a book is that before I sit down and write, I print out all the notes from all the books and articles that I read, and all my notes from the transcripts of the 250 interviews that I did. And in writing this book, that printout came to 8,500 pages, and that was a lot of reams of stuff. But if I had to pick a 4th one, and if I were gullible enough to want to do a 4th entire book's worth of research, I would probably have picked, and I would have lost the symmetry of the 50-year career, but I loved Miles Davis. I loved even more, when I was doing the research, Dizzy Gillespie. I loved a guy named Louis Russell. It would have been difficult, and any of them. And I want to suggest sometime, if you love jazz, sometime when you have an afternoon to spare in New York, go out to the Bronx and visit the Woodlawn Cemetery. And you will see a whole series of plots there with Duke Ellington, and you can see who he loved most in his family by who's next to him or who's separated by two other family members. You will see across the street the great Miles Davis's gravestone, and up the hill you have enough great jazz artists that I'm convinced if you go and do your trip at midnight, you will hear the most amazing jam session ever.
Last one. One. Sorry. I know that contracts and musicians owning their work is still something that we're struggling with today to figure out on their behalf and what they have the right to. But I would love to know how much they benefited monetarily during their time, and if they were able to build generational wealth now and have their families benefit
So there are
as much
two
as we have.
parts to that. That's a great question, and there are two parts to answering it. One is the money that was stolen from them during their lifetime by managers and by venues that didn't want to pay them the money that they paid not as good white artists to come into those same venues. So that was enough to create generational wealth for somebody. But they also made enough themselves. They ended up with good enough managers, and they ended up spending 300 days on the road till nearly the end of their lives. And in Count Basie's case, you could measure the wealth because it was all there in an estate. I mentioned that he had a daughter who was disabled, and she was disabled 5 different ways. The medical sheet outlining her disabilities, when they finally were able to diagnose them, had just about everything you could imagine. And yet, Catherine Basie insisted that the daughter not go to an institution, which was what most people did in those days. And there was enough money to take care of Catherine Basie, who was not expected to live out of her teen years. She died this year at age 78, something like that, enough for 78 years of taking care of her in amazing fashion. She had around-the-clock care and lived in a really nice house, and same thing for Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. They made a lot of money, and they spent a lot of money, but they left enough for generations after them to fight over their wealth. Great. So I think that was our last question, and I just want to say that the joy of being up here with Catherine Russell, I would love to take her on the road with me, or I'll go on the road with you, or would you give?
Oh, Larry Chai. And I tell you, this book, because I read it again. We had been together once before, and I read the book once, and I read it again for this interview. It's incredible, and I think that you will not find another book, another biography that delves into how people lived, such as this one. And so I just want to thank you for all the research that you've done on this.